The morning started like any other Tuesday in Millbrook. The coffee shop on Main Street was serving its usual customers. Kids were walking to school with backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, and the spring sun was just beginning to warm up the sleepy little town. Nobody knew that by lunchtime everything would change. At the old Hartwell estate on the hill, a construction crew had been working for 3 weeks. The massive brick mansion had stood empty for years, slowly falling apart while the town watched. Finally, a developer had bought it, planning to turn it into luxury apartments. The workers had seen plenty of old houses before, but this one felt different. There was something heavy about the place, like it was holding on to secrets. Mike Torres, the foreman, was checking the 3rd floor when one of his guys called out. They were supposed to be tearing down a wall in what used to be the music room, but something wasn't right. The wall sounded hollow. Mike walked over, knocked on it himself, and heard the same empty echo. His crew had found hidden spaces before. Usually they contained old newspapers, dead mice, or nothing at all. But something made him curious this time. They started carefully removing the bricks. Unlike the rest of the house, this wall wasn't connected to the main structure. Someone had built it later, sealing something off on purpose. As the first bricks came loose, dust poured out, making everyone cough and step back. When the air cleared, they shined their flashlights into the darkness. What they saw made them forget about their lunch breaks entirely. A grand piano sat in the sealed room, untouched and waiting. Even covered in decades of dust, it was clearly something special. The black finish still had a deep shine to it, and the legs were carved with intricate designs. This wasn't some cheap upright piano from a garage sale. This was the kind of instrument that belonged in concert halls. Mike called his boss, who told him to stop working and call the town council. Within an hour, people started showing up. The mayor came, still wearing her apron from the bakery she ran. The police chief stopped by to make sure everything was secure. And then someone smart suggested calling Helen Chen, the retired history teacher who knew more about Millbrook than anyone alive. Helen arrived with her cane and her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She was 78 years old and had lived in Millbrook her entire life. When she saw the piano through the broken wall, her hand went to her mouth. She stood there for a long moment, just staring. "That's the Hartwell piano," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard stories about it when I was a girl." Everyone thought it had been sold or destroyed. The workers carefully removed more bricks until they could step inside the sealed room. Helen went in first, moving slowly, treating the space like it was sacred ground. The room was small, maybe 12 feet by 15 feet, with no windows. Besides the piano, there was nothing else, no furniture, no decorations, nothing. Just the instrument and the dust and the silence. As Helen got closer to the piano, she noticed something strange. There were envelopes everywhere. Dozens of them, maybe more than 100, tucked between the piano strings, sitting on the music stand, even stuffed inside the bench. They were yellowed with age but sealed tight, like someone had wanted to make sure they stayed closed until the right moment. Mike carefully picked up one of the envelopes. There was a name written on it in beautiful, flowing handwriting, for the family of Thomas Webb. He picked up another, for the Kowalski family, and another, for Robert and Grace Patterson. "These are local names," the mayor said, looking over his shoulder. "Some of these families still live here." Helen reached out and touched the piano keys gently. They were stiff from years of not being played, but they still worked. A few notes rang out, slightly out of tune but clear enough. The sound filled the small room and seemed to echo with something more than just music. Then she saw it. Carved into the wooden panel above the keys, someone had scratched words into the piano itself. The letters were small but deep, made by someone who wanted them to last forever. Helen leaned close and read them out loud. For those who remember the summer of 1943, the room went quiet. Everyone there knew what that date meant. The summer of 1943 was right in the middle of World War II. But Millbrook had never been involved in the war, not really. A few local boys had gone off to fight, and everyone had dealt with rationing and war bonds, but nothing major had ever happened here. The town was too small, too far from anything important, or at least that's what everyone had always believed. Helen pulled out her phone with shaking hands and started making calls. First to the Historical Society, then to a few people she knew would care about this discovery. Within 2 hours, the Hartwell estate was crowded with curious townspeople, all wanting to see the piano and the mysterious letters. Word spread fast in a small town. By dinner time, everyone in Millbrook knew about the sealed room and the piano and the envelopes with local names on them. People started calling their relatives, asking if anyone remembered anything about the Hartwell family or the summer of 1943. Most folks came up empty. The Hartwells had been wealthy and kept to themselves, and they'd been gone from Millbrook for decades. The last one, old Eleanor Hartwell, had died back in 1989, and after that the estate had just sat empty. That evening, Helen sat in the mansion's front parlor with the mayor and a few council members. They had moved the envelopes to a table, organizing them carefully. There were 137 letters in total, all addressed to different people or families. Some of the names were familiar, others had been forgotten by time. The question everyone was asking was simple: should they open them? These letters had been sealed for over 80 years. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to hide them, to protect them, to preserve them. Opening them felt like breaking a promise somehow. But at the same time, they were addressed to people, or at least to the families of people. Didn't they have a right to know what was inside? Helen suggested they contact the families named on the envelopes first. Let them decide. The council agreed. Over the next few days, they tracked down descendants and sent out notifications. Some people responded right away, excited and curious. Others were nervous, wondering what kind of secrets might be hiding in those old letters. By the end of the week, the town council had organized a gathering at the community center. They would open the letters together with the families present. Whatever secrets the Hartwell piano had kept for all these years, Millbrook was about to discover them, and something in the air suggested that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The piano had waited 83 years to tell its story. Now finally, someone was ready to listen. The community center had never been so packed. Every folding chair was filled, and people lined the walls, craning their necks to see. The mayor had set up a microphone at the front, and the table beside her held stacks of those mysterious envelopes, organized by family name. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, making the dust particles dance in the air like tiny stars. Helen Chen sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap. She'd barely slept since they found the piano. Something about this whole thing felt important, bigger than just old letters and forgotten history. Next to her sat David Rosenberg, a 35-year-old teacher at the local high school. His grandmother had moved to Millbrook in 1944, and he'd always wondered why she never talked about her life before that. Maybe today he'd finally get some answers. The mayor cleared her throat and the room went silent. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "We're here because of a discovery that might change how we think about our town's history. We're going to open these letters together, out of respect for everyone involved. Whatever we learn today, we learn as a community." She picked up the first envelope. The name on it read, "For the family of Thomas Webb." An elderly woman in the third row raised her hand slowly. "That was my uncle," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He died in the war. Never came home." The mayor carefully broke the seal and pulled out a piece of paper. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded but still readable. She began to read aloud, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "My dear friends, if you are reading this, then time has finally allowed the truth to surface. Thomas Webb was a hero in ways that medals and monuments could never capture. In the summer of 1943, he came to me with an impossible request. He asked if I would be willing to risk everything I had, my home, my reputation, my freedom, to save lives. Without hesitation, I said yes." The mayor paused, looking up at the crowd before continuing. "Thomas was part of a network, a group of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They were helping Jewish families escape Europe, getting them safely to Canada where they could survive. But the route was dangerous and they needed safe houses along the way. Thomas asked me to turn the Hartwell estate into one of those houses. And so I did." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People looked at each other, confused. Millbrook had never been part of any war stories. It was just a quiet town in the middle of nowhere. How could this be true? But the mayor kept reading. "For 2 years, we sheltered families in the hidden rooms of the estate, sometimes just for a night, sometimes for weeks when it was too dangerous to move them. Thomas coordinated everything, making sure they had food, documents, and safe passage to the next stop. He saved 47 lives before his ship was torpedoed in the Atlantic. He never got to see the end of the war, but his courage lit the way for so many others. The elderly woman in the third row was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I never knew," she whispered. "Nobody ever told us. We just thought he died in battle." The mayor set down the first letter and picked up another. This one was addressed to the Kowalski family. A middle-aged man in the back stood up. "That's my family," he said. "My grandfather, Stefan Kowalski." This letter revealed even more. Stefan had owned the hardware store on Main Street, and he'd been supplying everything the operation needed. Locks, tools, even lumber to build the hidden rooms. He never charged Eleanor Hartwell a penny. The letter described how Stefan would make late-night deliveries, always careful, always quiet. He'd known that if anyone discovered what he was doing, he could lose everything. Letter after letter, the truth unfolded. The town doctor had provided medical care, asking no questions. A seamstress had made clothes for the refugees, working by candlelight after her shop closed. A farmer had donated food from his fields, driving his truck up to the estate under cover of darkness. A postal worker had helped forge documents. Even the old librarian had played a part, providing maps and teaching English to those who needed it. But the most stunning revelation came from a letter addressed to the Patterson family. Robert Patterson had been the local police chief in 1943, and everyone assumed he'd known nothing about the operation. The letter told a different story. Not only had he known, but he'd actively protected it. When federal agents came through town asking questions about suspicious activity, Robert had sent them in the wrong direction. When nosy neighbors reported strange comings and goings at the Hartwell estate, he'd dismissed their concerns as gossip. His grandson, a lawyer who still lived in Millbrook, stood up with tears in his eyes. "My grandfather never said a word," he told the room. "He took that secret to his grave. I always thought he was just a small-town cop, nothing special. But he was risking his career, maybe even prison, every single day." Helen Chen finally stood up, leaning on her cane. "The piano," she said, and everyone turned to look at her. Eleanor Hartwell was a concert pianist before she inherited the estate. Everyone in town knew that. But what we didn't know was that she used her music as signals. The mayor shuffled through the letters and found one that explained it. When Eleanor played certain pieces, Bach for danger, Chopin when the coast was clear, Beethoven when someone needed to move quickly, the network members knew what was happening. The piano could be heard from quite a distance on quiet nights, especially from Main Street. It was a code, hidden in plain sight, disguised as a wealthy woman's hobby. David Rosenberg finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "My grandmother," he said. Hannah Rosenberg. She came to Millbrook in 1944. She was 16 years old, and she never talked about where she came from or how she got here. Every time I asked, she'd just smile and say she'd been lucky. Was she one of them? One of the people who came through here? The mayor looked through the remaining letters, and near the bottom of the pile she found one. For Hannah, if she ever wants to know the truth. She handed it to David, and he opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a short note from Eleanor Hartwell, along with a photograph. The photo showed a young girl, barely more than a child, standing on the steps of the Hartwell estate. She was thin and frightened looking, but she was alive. The letter explained that Hannah had been smuggled out of Poland, traveling for 3 months through a network of safe houses. She'd arrived at the Hartwell estate in the dead of winter, frostbitten and half-starved. Eleanor had nursed her back to health over 6 weeks before arrangements could be made to get her to Canada. But Hannah had been so traumatized by everything she'd been through that the doctors worried she wouldn't survive the final leg of the journey. So Eleanor had made a decision. She'd found Hannah a family in Millbrook, people willing to take her in and give her a new life. David held the photograph in his hands, staring at the image of his grandmother as a teenager. Everything suddenly made sense. Why she'd never talked about her past, why she'd been so protective of their family, why she'd always insisted that kindness mattered more than anything else in the world. The room was completely silent now. The letters had revealed a secret that had been buried for more than 80 years. Millbrook wasn't just some forgettable small town. It had been part of something important, something that saved lives. Ordinary people, shopkeepers and farmers and police chiefs and piano players, had risked everything to do what was right. But as the shock began to wear off, a new feeling crept into the room. Pride mixed with something else, something uncomfortable, because not everyone in town had been a hero. And before the evening was over, they would discover that some families had a very different kind of secret to face. The next letter changed everything. The mayor's face went pale as she read it silently to herself first. Helen noticed and reached out to touch her arm. "What is it?" she asked quietly, but in the hushed room everyone heard. The mayor looked up at the crowd, then back down at the letter. "This one is addressed to the Morrison family," she said slowly. "Is anyone here from that family?" In the back corner, a woman in her 50s stood up. Claire Morrison owned the real estate office on Oak Street. She was well liked in town, always organized the Christmas toy drive, and her kids had gone to school with half the people in this room. "That's my family," she said, her voice cautious. "What does it say?" The mayor hesitated, which was unusual for her. She was normally direct, never one to dance around difficult topics, but this was different. "Maybe we should discuss this privately," she suggested. "No," Claire said firmly, walking toward the front of the room. "Whatever it says, read it here." Everyone else heard about their families. "I want to hear about mine." The mayor nodded slowly and began to read. "I write this letter with a heavy heart, knowing that truth is complicated and that good people sometimes make choices out of fear rather than hatred. In the fall of 1943, Harold Morrison discovered what we were doing at the estate. He was a clerk at the county office, and he noticed irregularities in some paperwork that Thomas Webb had filed. Harold confronted me one evening, demanding to know what was happening. The room was so quiet you could hear the old building settling, the creak of wooden beams overhead. Claire stood frozen near the front, her face unreadable. The mayor continued. "Harold threatened to report us to the authorities, not because he hated anyone, but because he was terrified. He had 3 young children and a sick wife. He believed that if he knew about this operation and said nothing, his family would be punished. We talked for hours that night. I tried to help him understand what was at stake, the lives we were saving. But fear is a powerful thing, and Harold couldn't see past it." Claire's hand moved to her mouth. People in the crowd started whispering to each other. The Morrison family had lived in Millbrook for generations. Claire's father had been mayor in the 80s. Her grandfather, Harold, had been a respected member of the community until he died in 1972. "In the end," the mayor read on, "Harold and I reached an understanding. He agreed to stay silent, but he refused to help. He said he would look the other way, pretend he'd never discovered the truth, but he couldn't actively participate. He was haunted by that decision for the rest of his life. I saw it in his eyes every time we passed on the street. Some people are built for courage, and others are simply trying to survive. I don't hate Harold Morrison. I pity him." Claire stood there, her hands shaking. "My grandfather never spoke about the war years," she said quietly. "He had nightmares sometimes. My father said he would wake up shouting. We always thought it was because he'd wanted to serve but had been rejected for medical reasons." She looked around the room at all the faces staring at her. "I didn't know. I swear I had no idea." David Rosenberg, still holding the photograph of his grandmother, spoke up. "It's not your fault, Claire. You weren't even born yet." But not everyone felt so generous. An older man near the window stood up. His name was Leonard Webb, Thomas's nephew. "Harold Morrison could have gotten them all killed," he said, his voice hard. "If he'd talked to the wrong person, if he'd made one phone call, 47 people would have died. My uncle would have died in prison instead of serving his country. That man was a coward." "He was scared," Claire shot back, her face flushed. "He had a family to protect. Not everyone can be a hero, but you can choose not to be a villain," Leonard replied. The room erupted. People started talking over each other, some defending Harold Morrison, others condemning him. The mayor tried to restore order, but the damage was done. The revelation had cracked something open in Millbrook, exposing a question nobody wanted to face. What would they have done in Harold's position? Over the next week, the town became divided in ways nobody had seen before. People who'd been friends for decades stopped speaking to each other. The local paper ran a front-page story about the discovery, and suddenly reporters from bigger cities started showing up, asking questions, interviewing anyone who would talk. The story was compelling, a small town with a secret history of heroism hidden for 80 years. But with the attention came arguments. At a town council meeting 3 days later, the debate reached a boiling point. David Rosenberg stood at the microphone, passionate and determined. "We need to honor what happened here," he said. "These people risked everything. We should restore the piano, create a memorial, maybe even a small museum at the Hartwell estate. This is important history. Claire Morrison was there too, standing in the back with her arms crossed. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was steady but tired. I understand wanting to honor the heroes, she said. But what about people like my grandfather? What about the families who have to live with the knowledge that their relatives weren't brave enough? Opening this up, making it public, it feels like we're putting people on trial who can't defend themselves. Helen Chen, who'd been quiet during most of the debate, finally stood up. I understand both sides, she said. But I keep thinking about Eleanor Hartwell. She's the one who sealed that room. She's the one who hid those letters for 80 years. She knew this would be complicated. She knew it would hurt some people. But she still left those letters behind. That has to mean something. The mayor called for a vote on whether to proceed with a public memorial. The council was split 3-3, a deadlock. They decided to table the discussion for another week, hoping cooler heads would prevail. But outside the town hall, the arguments continued. At the local diner, people who used to sit together now chose separate tables. The hardware store, once owned by Stefan Kowalski, and now run by his great-niece, became an unofficial gathering place for those who wanted the memorial. They'd meet there in the evenings, planning what it might look like, how they could honor the rescue network. Meanwhile, those who opposed the idea would meet at the coffee shop on Main Street, worried about what this attention would do to their quiet town. The divide wasn't just about the past. It was about what they owed to history, whether some truths were better left buried, and how to handle the uncomfortable reality that heroes and cowards had lived side by side in the same small town. Some families felt proud, discovering that their grandparents had been part of something noble. Others felt shame, learning that their relatives had turned away when courage was needed most. The piano itself remained at the Hartwell estate, still dusty, still silent. The developer had stopped all renovation work, unsure of what to do now that the property had become the center of such controversy. Some nights people would drive up the hill just to look at the old mansion, its windows dark, holding its secrets close. David Rosenberg visited the estate one evening, standing in the room where the piano waited. He touched the keys gently, the same keys his grandmother might have heard all those years ago. The notes rang out of tune and lonely in the empty space. He thought about Eleanor Hartwell playing her coded messages, about his grandmother arriving here as a frightened teenager, about all the lives saved and all the lives changed by what happened in this house. But he also thought about Harold Morrison, lying awake at night, knowing what was happening and choosing silence. Was that complicity or survival? Where was the line between protecting your family and protecting your conscience? These were the questions Millbrook was wrestling with now, and there were no easy answers. As David left the estate that evening, he realized something. The piano hadn't just revealed the past. It had forced everyone to ask themselves a harder question. What would I have done? And most people, if they were honest, weren't sure they knew the answer. 2 weeks after the letters were opened, Millbrook was barely recognizable. The town that had once prided itself on being friendly and close-knit now felt fractured. People walked past each other on the sidewalk without saying hello. The Autumn Festival Committee had canceled their annual planning meeting because too many members refused to work together. Even at church on Sunday, families sat on opposite sides of the room. Helen Chen watched it all with growing sadness. She'd lived through enough decades to know that communities could tear themselves apart over smaller things than this. One morning she sat in her living room surrounded by old photo albums and newspaper clippings, searching for something. She knew Eleanor Hartwell had been deliberate about everything she did. The woman didn't seal a piano behind a wall on a whim. There had to be more to the story. She was looking through a box of her late husband's things when she found it, a journal he'd kept during his years as a contractor in the 80s. Helen's husband had done some repair work at the Hartwell estate in 1988, just a year before Eleanor died. She'd never paid much attention to his work journals before, but now she flipped through the pages carefully, looking for any mention of the estate. And there it was, an entry from November 1988. Mrs. Hartwell asked me to do something strange today. She wanted me to check the structural integrity of the music room wall, said she was thinking about sealing something important inside, offered me double my usual rate to do it and never speak of it. The old woman seemed sad, like she was saying goodbye to something. I took the job, A man doesn't ask questions when a client wants privacy. Helen's hands trembled as she read. So Eleanor had sealed the piano herself, just months before she died. But why? The war had been over for more than 40 years by then. Why hide it all over again? Helen kept reading, hoping for more details, but her husband had written nothing else about it. She sat back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand. That afternoon, she drove to the county archives, a dusty building downtown that most people forgot existed. The clerk was a young woman named Patricia, who looked bored until Helen explained what she was looking for. "I need to see any records related to Eleanor Hartwell from the late 80s, Helen said. "Letters, legal documents, anything." Patricia's eyes lit up. Like everyone else in town, she'd been following the piano story. "Give me an hour," she said, disappearing into the back rooms. Helen waited, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the tick of an old clock on the wall. When Patricia returned, she was carrying a folder. "There's not much," she said, "but there is this. It's dated January 1989, just a few weeks before Eleanor Hartwell died. It was filed with her will, but marked as not to be opened unless the piano is discovered." Helen's heart raced as she opened the folder. Inside was a letter, handwritten on Eleanor's personal stationery. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind people didn't use anymore. The letter was addressed simply, "To the future." Helen read it once, then twice, then a third time. When she finished, she sat there in the quiet archives, tears running down her face. Patricia handed her a tissue without saying anything. They both understood that this changed everything. That evening, Helen called an emergency town meeting. The mayor was skeptical at first. Another meeting might just make things worse. But Helen insisted, and something in her voice convinced everyone to come. By 7 o'clock, the community center was packed again. The same chairs filled with the same people, but the atmosphere was different, tense, wary. Helen walked to the front of the room, moving slowly with her cane. She was tired, and the weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her shoulders. But she'd promised herself she'd see this through. "I found something," she said simply. "A letter from Eleanor Hartwell written just before she died. I'm going to read it to all of you, and then maybe we can finally understand what she wanted us to learn." The room went silent. Even the people who'd been arguing in the parking lot before the meeting stopped and listened. Helen unfolded the letter carefully and began to read. "My dear friends of the future, if you have found my piano and opened my letters, then you have learned that Millbrook was once part of something greater than itself. You have learned that ordinary people did extraordinary things, but you have also learned that not everyone was brave, and I imagine this has caused pain and division among you. That was not my intention, though I knew it might be unavoidable." Helen paused, looking up at the crowd. Claire Morrison sat in the same spot as before, her expression guarded. David Rosenberg was there too, along with Leonard Webb and dozens of others whose lives had been changed by the discovery. "I have lived with these memories for over 40 years. Helen continued reading. "I have watched this town grow and change, seen children become parents and grandparents. And I have learned something important. Heroism and cowardice are not opposites. They are neighbors in the human heart, sometimes living so close together that it's hard to tell them apart." The words hung in the air. People shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but attentive. "Harold Morrison came to me in 1987, 2 years before I sealed the piano. He was dying of cancer and wanted to talk. We sat in my music room for 3 hours while he told me everything. His guilt, his shame, the nightmares that had haunted him for decades. He said he'd spent his whole life wondering if he'd been a coward or just a man trying to protect his family. He never found peace with that question." Claire's face crumpled. She covered her mouth with her hand, fighting back tears. Several people nearby reached out to touch her shoulder, offering silent comfort. "But here is what Harold told me that day, and what I need all of you to understand. In 1944, a year after he discovered our operation, something happened. Federal agents came to town asking questions. They knew something was going on in this area, but they didn't know what or where. Harold Morrison, the man who had threatened to turn us in out of fear, went to those agents and deliberately lied. He sent them to the wrong towns, gave them false leads, wasted weeks of their time. He put himself at enormous risk to protect the very operation he'd been too afraid to join." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Leonard Webb leaned forward in his seat, his expression shifting from anger to confusion to something else. maybe understanding. When I asked Harold why he did it, he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "I couldn't be brave enough to help, but I couldn't be coward enough to destroy what you were doing either. So I found a middle way, even though it meant lying awake every night wondering if I'd be arrested." That was the burden he carried until the day he died. Helen's voice cracked slightly, but she kept reading. "I tell you this because I want you to understand that people are complicated. Most of us are not heroes or villains. We are something in between, doing the best we can with the courage we have. The people who helped us save lives deserve to be honored, and I hope you will do that. But the people who stayed silent, who looked away, who were paralyzed by fear, they deserve compassion too, because many of them were fighting their own battles we could not see." The room was so quiet that Helen could hear her own breathing. She looked up from the letter, her eyes moving across the faces in the crowd. "Eleanor wrote more," she said. She included something else with this letter. Detailed journals documenting everything that happened in 1943 and 1944. Every person saved. Every act of courage. Every moment of doubt. But she also wrote about the people who opposed them. And she did something remarkable. She tried to understand them instead of just condemning them. Helen set down the letter and picked up a leather-bound journal from the folder. She wanted these journals preserved, but not to create a simple story of good versus evil. She wanted future generations to see the complexity of moral choices during impossible times. She wanted us to remember that judgment is easy, but understanding requires courage of a different kind. David Rosenberg stood up slowly. He looked at Claire Morrison across the room. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I was so focused on honoring my grandmother and the others who helped her that I forgot that fear is human too. Your grandfather may have been afraid, but in the end he still did something brave." Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry too," she said. "I've been so defensive, so ashamed that I couldn't see that we should honor the people who helped. They deserve that." Helen watched as something shifted in the room. Not everything was fixed. There were still wounds that would take time to heal. But the anger that had been building for 2 weeks seemed to deflate, replaced by something gentler. Understanding, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. The mayor stood up and walked to the front. "I think Eleanor Hartwell just gave us a gift," she said. "She showed us how to move forward. We honor the heroes without pretending the story was simple. We acknowledge the fear without letting it define everything. And we use this history to ask ourselves better questions about courage and compassion." People started talking quietly to each other. The conversation softer now, more thoughtful. The divide hadn't disappeared, but it felt less like a chasm, and more like something that could be bridged. As the meeting ended and people filed out into the cool autumn evening, there was a sense that maybe, just maybe, Millbrook could find its way through this together. The weeks following Eleanor's letter brought a different energy to Millbrook. The anger hadn't completely disappeared, but it had transformed into something more productive. People started talking instead of arguing, listening instead of accusing. It was slow work, the kind that required patience and forgiveness, but it was happening. Helen Chen organized a series of small gatherings at the library, where families could come and share their stories. Some talked about grandparents who'd been heroes. Others spoke about relatives who'd been afraid. And slowly people started to see that almost every family had both kinds of ancestors, the brave and the frightened, sometimes even in the same person. Claire Morrison came to one of these gatherings and brought something with her. It was a box of her grandfather Harold's belongings that she'd found in her attic. Inside were newspaper clippings about the war, letters he'd written but never sent, and a small diary with only a few entries. She read one entry aloud to the group, her voice shaking slightly. October 1944. I wake up every morning wondering if today will be the day they catch me in my lies. I sent those agents to Burlington instead of here. Told them I'd seen suspicious activity near the Canadian border. They believe me. I am terrified of what will happen if they discover the truth, but I'm more terrified of living with myself if I let innocent people die, because I was too afraid to act. I am not brave like Thomas Webb or Eleanor Hartwell, but maybe this is the only courage I have to give. When she finished reading, the room was silent for a moment. Then David Rosenberg spoke up. Your grandfather saved lives too, he said quietly. My grandmother might have been caught if those agents had come here instead of Burlington. Thank you for sharing this. Claire smiled through her tears, and several people came up to hug her afterward. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. The wounds were beginning to heal. Meanwhile, a committee had formed to decide what to do with the piano and the Hartwell estate. The developer, seeing the historical importance of the property, had agreed to work with the town. After several meetings and discussions, they came up with a plan that honored Eleanor's wishes while serving the community's needs. They would restore the Hartwell estate, but not as luxury apartments. Instead, the main house would become a community center and small museum dedicated to the rescue network. Eleanor's journals would be preserved there, along with photographs, documents, and the stories of everyone involved, both the heroes and those who struggled with fear. The goal wasn't to create a simple narrative of good versus evil, but to show the complexity of human nature during difficult times, and at the heart of it all would be the piano. A restoration expert was brought in from the city, a woman named Victoria Chen, no relation to Helen, though they joked about it. Victoria had restored instruments in concert halls and museums around the world, but she said this was the most meaningful project she'd ever worked on. She spent 3 weeks carefully cleaning the piano, replacing broken strings and bringing it back to life. The day the restoration was completed, Victoria invited Helen to be the first to hear it. They stood in the old music room where the piano had been sealed for so many decades. Victoria had opened the windows and afternoon sunlight streamed in, making the polished black surface shine like new. "Would you like to play something?" Victoria asked. Helen shook her head. "I was never musical," she said with a small smile. "But I know someone who should be here." She made a phone call, and 20 minutes later, David Rosenberg arrived with his grandmother Hannah. The elderly woman moved slowly, using a walker, but her eyes were bright with curiosity. She hadn't been to the Hartwell estate since 1944, more than 80 years ago. When Hannah saw the piano, she stopped in the doorway. Her hand went to her heart, and for a long moment she just stood there, remembering. David held her arm gently, giving her time. Finally, she moved forward, one careful step at a time, until she was standing beside the instrument. "I heard this piano the night I arrived," she said softly, her accent still carrying traces of the Polish she'd spoken as a child. "I was so scared. I didn't know where I was or what would happen to me. But then I heard music coming from somewhere in the house. It was Chopin, a nocturne. It sounded like home, like safety. I knew then that maybe I would be okay." She reached out and touched the keys with one trembling finger. A single note rang out clear and pure. Victoria had tuned it perfectly. "Would you like to try playing?" she asked gently. Hannah nodded. David helped her sit on the bench, and she positioned her hands over the keys. "I haven't played in many years," she said. "My fingers don't work like they used to. But I remember this piece. Eleanor taught it to me during those weeks I stayed here. She said music was a language that needed no translation." She began to play, and despite her age and her arthritis, something beautiful emerged. It was Chopin, the same nocturne she'd heard that first night. The notes were hesitant at first, uncertain, but then they grew stronger. The music filled the room, spilling out through the open windows into the autumn air. People walking on Main Street heard it. They stopped and looked up toward the hill where the Hartwell estate stood. Some of them recognized the melody. Others just felt something in their chest, a tightness that was both sadness and hope mixed together. When Hannah finished playing, she sat quietly for a moment, her hands still resting on the keys. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for finding this piano. Thank you for telling our stories." The official opening of the Hartwell Memorial Center happened on a crisp day in November 2026, almost 6 months after the construction workers had first discovered the sealed room. The entire town turned out for the ceremony. Folding chairs were set up on the front lawn, and a small stage had been built near the entrance. The mayor spoke first, talking about the importance of remembering history and all its complexity. Then Helen Chen said a few words about Eleanor Hartwell and her desire for understanding rather than judgment. Several other people shared brief stories about their ancestors, both those who'd helped and those who'd struggled with fear. But the most powerful moment came when David Rosenberg and Claire Morrison walked to the stage together. They'd become friends over the past months, united by their shared understanding of complicated legacies. They unveiled a plaque that would hang in the center's entrance hall. It read, "In memory of those who found courage in the darkest times, and in recognition that most of us live somewhere between heroism and fear, doing the best we can with what we have. May we learn from both the bravery and the struggles of those who came before us. After the speeches, everyone was invited inside to see the restored piano and explore the new museum. The exhibits were thoughtfully designed, showing not just the rescue operation but also the personal struggles of everyone involved. There were letters from the refugees who'd been saved, photographs of the network members, and honest accounts of those who'd been too frightened to help. But the centerpiece was the piano itself, positioned in the renovated music room. A sign invited visitors to sit and play if they wished, continuing the tradition of music that Eleanor had started so many years ago. As the afternoon wore on and people explored the center, something unexpected happened. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, sat down at the piano and began to play a simple melody she'd learned in school. Her mother stood nearby, smiling and recording on her phone. Other children gathered around, fascinated by the big instrument and the story behind it. Helen watched from across the room, leaning on her cane, and felt tears in her eyes. This was what Eleanor had wanted, not a monument to the past, but a living place where new generations could learn and grow and maybe find their own courage when they needed it. David stood beside her, his grandmother's photograph in his pocket. "Do you think Eleanor knew?" he asked. "When she sealed that piano, do you think she knew it would bring the town together like this?" Helen considered the question. "I think she hoped," she said finally. She understood that truth is complicated and that healing takes time. But she also believed that people were capable of growth, of understanding, of forgiveness. She bet on the future, and I think maybe we proved her right. As evening approached and the celebration continued, someone else sat down at the piano. It was Leonard Webb, Thomas's nephew, the man who'd been so angry at the first meeting. He played something simple and beautiful, and when he finished, he looked over at Claire Morrison and nodded. She nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd all come. The piano that had been hidden for 83 years was finally home. It would sit in this room, in this house, telling its story to anyone who wanted to listen, and every time someone played its keys, the music would carry with it a reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, that fear and courage often exist side by side, and that the truth, no matter how complicated, is always worth remembering. Millbrook had learned something important. The town wasn't perfect and its past wasn't simple, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the real story worth telling wasn't about heroes and villains, but about human beings trying their best in impossible situations, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, but always deserving of understanding. The piano played on into the evening, its notes drifting across the town like a promise that the past could inform the future without imprisoning it, and that music, like truth, had the power to heal.